3 generals just got fired. Not for losing battles, for refusing impossible orders. The Pentagon wanted it covered up. MacArthur blamed everyone except himself. But here's what they don't tell you. Australian commanders stopped a Japanese invasion while being ordered to move faster by a general sitting in an air-conditioned office 1,800 kilometers away. They saved Port Moresby while being accused of cowardice by someone who spent 1 hour looking at the battlefield. And when they were sacked for doing everything right, their replacements succeeded because of the foundation these men had built. You think command conflicts are about ego? Think again. This is what happens when politicians in Brisbane prioritize appeasing an American general over trusting their own commanders who are actually fighting the war. Stay until the end, because you're about to see what happens when doing your job correctly gets you fired anyway. Lieutenant General Sidney Rowell walked into General Thomas Blamey's office knowing exactly what was coming. Blamey did not waste time on pleasantries or explanations that might soften the blow. Rowell confronted Blamey on the issue and was relieved of command on the 28th of September. In a communication to Curtin, Blamey referred to Rowell as insubordinate and obstructive. Rowell was not insubordinate. He had conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal against overwhelming Japanese forces across terrain that made supply nearly impossible. He had preserved his outnumbered troops while bleeding the enemy white through constant delaying actions. Port Moresby was safe because of his tactical brilliance, but General Douglas MacArthur, sitting in Brisbane, saw only Australian troops retreating. He did not understand the Kokoda track. He did not understand jungle warfare. He did not understand that outnumbered defenders conducting fighting withdrawals was textbook tactics when facing superior forces. MacArthur refused to take the Japanese threat seriously, believing that once the U.S. Marines landed at Guadalcanal on the 7th of August, the Japanese might withdraw from Buna. The Japanese did not withdraw. They pushed south toward Port Moresby with 5,000 combat-hardened troops. From his GHQ in Brisbane, MacArthur still did not comprehend that his own Allied troops were greatly outnumbered by the Japanese troops on the Kokoda Trail. In reality, there were only about 400 Australians facing 5,000 Japanese. 400 against 5,000. That is not cowardice forcing retreat. That is mathematics forcing tactical withdrawal while inflicting maximum casualties on an enemy stretching their supply lines to breaking point. But MacArthur needed someone to blame for the terrifying reality that Japanese forces were within striking distance of Port Moresby. On the 6th of September, MacArthur said that the Australians have proven themselves unable to match the enemy in jungle fighting. Aggressive leadership is lacking. This statement was a shameful lie designed to protect MacArthur's reputation. Australian militia boys, teenagers who had never fired rifles in combat before, were stopping veteran Japanese jungle fighters through sheer determination and brilliant leadership from officers like Rowell and Brigadier Arnold Potts. MacArthur's criticism of the Australian troops was a shameful attempt to protect his own position, but MacArthur had Prime Minister John Curtin's ear. He convinced Curtin to send Blamey to Papua to take personal command and energize the situation. Jack Beazley suggested that Blamey would make a convenient scapegoat. Moresby is going to fall. Send Blamey up there and let him fall with it. Blamey understood the political trap being set. If Port Moresby fell, he would take the blame instead of MacArthur. His survival depended on proving he was fixing the situation, regardless of whether anything actually needed fixing. Rowell's only mistake was believing his commanding officer would support him against political pressure from MacArthur. Blamey chose self-preservation over loyalty to his subordinate, who was winning the campaign. The irony is devastating. On his return, Blamey was able to assure the government of his confidence in Rowell and that the situation was in hand. Blamey admitted Rowell was doing everything correctly. Then, he fired him anyway 2 weeks later because MacArthur kept applying pressure, and Blamey would not risk his own position to defend his subordinate. But Rowell was just the first casualty in what would become a purge of competent Australian commanders whose only crime was refusing to accept orders that ignored battlefield reality. October 22, 1942. Somewhere on the Kokoda track, Brigadier Arnold Potts listened to Blamey deliver what soldiers still call the running rabbit speech. Blamey told exhausted troops who had been fighting against overwhelming odds for months that they had not fought hard enough, that they had run like rabbits from the enemy. In a private interview on 22nd October, the day of the Running Rabbit address, Blamey told Potts he was no longer required in New Guinea. Potts had commanded the 21st Brigade through some of the most desperate fighting in Australian military history. His troops had conducted fighting withdrawals that military historians now study as examples of brilliant tactical leadership under impossible conditions. They had saved Port Moresby through sacrifice that cost hundreds of Australian lives. Blamey fired him for political theater. MacArthur wanted aggressive commanders who attacked regardless of circumstances. Potts understood that suicidal attacks against prepared Japanese positions in mountainous jungle achieved nothing except filling body bags. October 28, 1942. Maiola, Papua New Guinea. Major General Arthur Allen watched an aircraft land carrying Major General George Vasey, who was arriving to take command of the 7th Division. Pressured to hasten the advance by MacArthur, Allen was replaced by Major General George Vasey on the 28th of October. Allen had done everything correctly. His troops had turned the Japanese retreat into a rout. They were pursuing a broken enemy back across the Owen Stanley Range. But supply was the constant nightmare that MacArthur sitting in Brisbane could not comprehend. MacArthur and Blamey were ignorant to the conditions the Allen and his man faced on the Kokoda Trail. Allen faced a lack of supplies, which were difficult to deliver to the front at Kokoda. In one instance, the supplies were dropped too far forward against his request and severely delayed the advance. Everything had to be carried by hand up and down mountains where healthy men could barely walk. Papuan carriers performed miracles, but there was never enough food or ammunition at the front. Allen refused to advance faster than his logistics could support because that would have meant Australian soldiers dying from starvation or running out of ammunition during contact with the enemy. This was professional military judgment. This was protecting his troops. This was refusing to sacrifice Australian lives for MacArthur's impatience. It cost him his command. The savage irony is that Vasey succeeded because of Allen's groundwork. The 25th Brigade was held up at Templeton's Crossing from 16th October until the 16th Brigade pushed through on 20th October and advanced towards Eora village. Here, the advance was held until the Japanese forces withdrew on October 28th. Allen was fired on October 28th. Kokoda fell to Australian forces on November 2nd, just 5 days later. The timeline Allen had predicted, based on actual supply capabilities, proved exactly correct. The advance happened at the pace Allen said was sustainable when he explained logistics to headquarters. But MacArthur claimed vindication. His decision to replace Allen had supposedly accelerated victory. This narrative ignored that Vasey inherited a winning situation that Allen had created through careful planning and realistic assessment of what his exhausted troops could accomplish. 3 generals, Rowell, Potts, Allen, all sacked within 4 weeks during a victorious campaign. Not one relieved for military failure. All sacrificed for political expediency to satisfy MacArthur's ego and protect Blamey's position. Arthur Allen, respected commander at Buna, was replaced under pressure from MacArthur. Australians viewed the decision as unfair, reinforcing perceptions of political interference in military command. But here is what MacArthur and Blamey did not count on. History would vindicate these commanders decades later when documents were declassified and the truth emerged about what actually happened on Kokoda. The campaign was also notable because so much misunderstanding existed back in Australia at the time about what was actually happening along the trail. While the Australian defenders were steadily falling back before the advancing Japanese, theirs was no abject retreat, but a tenacious, uncompromising, and measured withdrawal. The Australian commanders refused MacArthur's orders not because of cowardice or incompetence. They refused unrealistic timelines that ignored terrain, supply constraints, disease, and exhaustion. They refused to sacrifice their men in pointless attacks when fighting withdrawals achieved strategic objectives while preserving combat power. Rowell refused to pass on MacArthur's panicked messages during the Milne Bay battle because he trusted General Close to conduct the battle properly without interference from headquarters. Close won the first Allied land victory against Japan. MacArthur learned nothing. Allen refused to advance faster than logistics supported because he understood that speed without supplies equals dead soldiers. He was proven correct when his predicted timeline matched exactly what Vasey achieved. These were not acts of defiance. These were acts of professional military judgment by commanders who prioritized mission success and soldier welfare over pleasing politicians. The Australian 7th Division did not refuse MacArthur's orders at Kokoda. Australian commanders refused to accept impossible demands from someone who spent 1 hour looking at the battlefield before returning to air-conditioned headquarters 1,800 kilometers away. Sometimes the greatest act of military leadership is saying no to orders that will get your troops killed for no tactical gain. Sometimes protecting your soldiers means risking your career by contradicting generals who outrank you, but do not understand the battlefield. Rowell, Potts, Allen. These men saved Port Moresby through brilliant tactics under impossible conditions. They were fired for political reasons by commanders more concerned with their own positions than with supporting subordinates who were winning the campaign. History remembers them as heroes despite the injustice they suffered. MacArthur is remembered as the general who blamed Australian troops for his own failures. Blamey is remembered as the general who sacrificed loyal subordinates to save himself. That is what happened when Australian commanders refused MacArthur's impossible orders at Kokoda. They did their jobs correctly. They won the campaign. They got fired anyway. Sometimes doing everything right still costs you everything.